So what is
I want to speak in sex life.
You must
We can all have a great sex life. Christ God, so we could have great sex.
Everyone saw the smiles on camera, the polished broadcasts, the perfect image. But behind the scenes, something was brewing. One unexpected moment shattered the illusion, and Joni Lamb made a decision that stunned even those closest to her. No one saw it coming. What happened in private would soon echo across the entire ministry world. Was it betrayal, a revelation, or something far more personal? One thing is certain. After this, nothing was ever the same again. At first, everything about Joni Lamb and dougweiss looked like a perfect love story. After the heartbreaking loss of her husband Marcus, Joni had found someone new, someone who seemed to understand her world, her mission, and her heart. Doug wasn't just anyone. He was a respected Christian counselor, someone known for guiding couples through tough seasons. So when they announced their relationship and later their marriage, people celebrated. It felt like a blessing, like God had given Joni a second chance at happiness. But as time went on, the cracks began to show. It didn't happen overnight. The changes were small at first, easy to miss unless you were really paying attention. Doug, who once stood proudly by Joni's side during public events, began showing up less and less. When he did appear, their connection didn't feel the same. There were no more warm smiles or shared glances. Instead, there was a quiet tension between them. It was in the way they didn't quite look at each other, the way they spoke carefully, almost like strangers trying to keep up appearances. Fans started to notice. Social media, once filled with shared photos and faith-filled captions, grew quieter. Joni returned to posting mostly about ministry. Doug became more distant online. Still, no one said anything. After all, every couple goes through rough patches, right? But behind the scenes, the silence spoke volumes. People close to them saw the shift. Some said Doug was struggling with the pressure of being in the spotlight. Others claimed he wasn't ready for the level of attention that came with being Joni Lamb's husband. In private, their differences started to grow. Their once united front began to feel like two people pulling in opposite directions. They kept showing up for the cameras. They kept saying all the right things. But the truth was already slipping through the cracks. The marriage that once looked picture perfect was quietly starting to fall apart, and the world was beginning to see it. The moment that changed everything didn't happen on a stage or under bright studio lights. It happened quietly in a living room, during what should have been an ordinary conversation. Joni had sat down with one of her children, someone she trusted deeply, someone she believed could listen without judgment. What she said that night would become the turning point no one in the family ever expected. It began with a hesitation, a long breath, a strange seriousness in Joni's voice that instantly told her daughter something was wrong. She said she needed to talk about something personal, something she wasn't sure how to explain. Then, almost reluctantly, she mentioned text messages Doug had sent her early in their relationship, messages that, according to her, were more intimate than anyone knew, messages filled with sexual language she hadn't shared with anyone before. Her daughter sat there frozen, caught between disbelief and confusion. She loved her mother. She wanted to support her, but she wasn't prepared for this. These weren't harmless little confessions. These were heavy revelations that didn't match the image Doug presented publicly. The calm Christian counselor, the man who preached boundaries, purity, and propriety. Suddenly, the daughter felt as if she had been thrown into a world she didn't recognize. As Joni continued talking, describing the texts in pieces, the daughter felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know whether her mother was sharing a moment of vulnerability or handing her a burden too heavy to carry. She nodded, she listened, and she tried to keep her composure, but inside, she felt her entire body closing in. There were words she wasn't ready to hear, images she didn't want in her mind, emotions she didn't know how to process. That night marked the beginning of her panic attacks. They came quietly at first, fast heartbeat, shaky breathing, a sense that something wasn't right. She tried hiding them, pretending she was fine, but it only grew worse. She didn't tell her siblings. She didn't tell friends. She felt trapped between protecting her mother and carrying a secret she didn't ask for. In the weeks that followed, the weight of those texts began to change the atmosphere around the family. Every conversation felt colder. Every room felt heavier. Joni continued running the ministry as if nothing had happened, but her daughter saw the stress building behind her eyes. The family meals grew quieter. The laughter didn't come as easily. and whenever Doug was mentioned, a slight tension moved across the room like a shadow. The daughter eventually reached her breaking point. One night, overwhelmed and unable to sleep, she called someone she trusted, Jimmy Evans. He had been a long-time spiritual voice in their family, someone who had guided them through grief and faith challenges over the years. She didn't want to expose her mother. She didn't want to destroy anyone's reputation. She simply needed to understand what she'd been told. Was it normal? Was it innocent? Was it a red flag she wasn't allowed to name? She told Jimmy only enough to ask for clarity, not details. She spoke nervously, stumbling over words, trying to protect everyone at once while also desperately needing help. Jimmy listened carefully, asking questions to make sure he understood the situation. He didn't radiate judgment, but he also didn't ignore the discomfort in her voice. He could hear the distress. He could hear the confusion she was drowning under. That call, though private, became the silent spark that lit everything else. Nothing exploded immediately. There were no dramatic confrontations or loud arguments, but the atmosphere shifted. Johnny sensed something was wrong. The daughter's distance, her sudden anxiety, the fact that she no longer spoke freely. Doug felt it too. There was tension in the air that no one named out loud, but everyone recognized. When the family eventually arranged a meeting with Jimmy, all 6 of them in the same room, the daughter knew that the weight she'd been carrying was about to collide with reality. She sat there, quiet, avoiding eye contact, unsure whether the truth would come out or whether they would continue pretending nothing had happened. Every breath felt shaky. Her hands trembled. She wondered whether her mother was angry. She wondered whether Doug suspected something. And she wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake by ever speaking up. That meeting became the moment where every hidden emotion came to the surface. Regret, confusion, embarrassment, worry, fear. Not because of a single text message, but because of what the messages represented. A private world that didn't match the public image. A conversation that blurred boundaries. A confession that cracked open something fragile inside the family. From that day forward, nothing felt the same. The daughter could no longer unhear what she'd been told. Joni could no longer pretend she hadn't shared something too intimate, and Doug could no longer escape the growing distance forming between him and the people closest to Joni. Every tension, every whisper, every uncomfortable silence traced back to that private moment. The moment one text message became 10, then a memory, then a secret too heavy for anyone to carry alone. It didn't destroy the marriage that day, but it began the unraveling, slow, painful, and impossible to stop. The kind of unraveling that starts in private but eventually reaches the surface, no matter how tightly anyone tries to hold it together. At first, no one saw it coming. The divorce between Joni Lamb and Dougweiss seemed impossible, almost unbelievable to those who followed their story. After all, Joni had spent decades in the public eye, building her life and ministry with Marcus Lamb, and after his passing, it seemed like she had found a second chance at happiness. Doug, a well-known Christian counselor, appeared to be the perfect match, someone who understood her world and her calling. Their union had been framed as a divine restoration, a love story that God had written. But behind the scenes, the picture-perfect narrative was quietly unraveling. For months, rumors had swirled, growing from quiet whispers to louder questions. Observant fans noticed subtle but telling signs: fewer joint appearances, colder body language, and silence where there had once been open affection. Their social media pages, once filled with loving captions and public prayers, grew quiet. Then came the real shock, the announcement that they had divorced. No one knew exactly when it had happened. There was no big statement, no shared video sitting on a cozy couch, thanking fans for their support. The news simply slipped out, first through whispers, then through confirmations from sources close to the situation. Fans were stunned. Christian communities that had once celebrated their marriage now found themselves asking what had gone wrong. Joni, who had always been seen as composed and in control, was now at the center of a deeply personal and very public storm. Her entire brand was built around faith, family, and strength. This divorce wasn't just a private heartbreak, it was a collapse of an image that millions had admired and trusted. She had stood before congregations, before cameras, preaching about God's plan, about faith through pain, about healing after loss. And now she was walking through another loss, this one without the comforting narrative that had followed her the first time. The shock wasn't just about the end of the marriage, it was about what it represented. If Joni and Doug couldn't make it, what did that say about everything they had preached? About the books, the sermons, the advice? And what about Doug? A man known for counseling couples through crisis, now in a crisis of his own, and not just privately. His entire career was built on helping marriages survive, and now he couldn't survive his own. The irony was bitter. As the news spread, the fallout began. People started digging. Old videos were rewatched, podcast episodes dissected. Every interaction between Joni and Doug was now seen in a new light. Clips that once seemed sweet now looked forced. Smiles that once radiated love now felt strained. Behind every image was the question, when did it all start falling apart? Then came the speculation. Some said Doug had struggled to adjust to the spotlight. Others claimed Joni had grown distant, overwhelmed by her responsibilities. Still others suggested deeper issues, conflicts about control, vision, trust, and then, of course, the texts. The messages Doug had allegedly sent before the marriage, intimate, suggestive, and completely out of sync with the image he had presented to the public. Those messages became the turning point for many, not just because of what they said, but because of what they implied. That maybe this marriage hadn't been built on a stable foundation, that maybe, in the rush to heal, both had ignored red flags. And as more details emerged, family tension, private stress, legal rumors, the story only became more painful. For Joni, it was a nightmare. She had already lived through one massive loss, the death of Marcus Lamb, her partner in life and ministry. Rebuilding after that took everything she had. And now, after finally believing she had found stability again, it all crumbled once more. Except this time, it was different. This time, people questioned her, judged her. Some sympathized, but others accused her of failing, of marrying too quickly, of trusting the wrong person. Doug faced his own firestorm. His credibility took a hit overnight. Churches canceled appearances. Clients pulled away. Questions were raised about his past, his intentions, his counseling methods. Some still defended him, insisting that no one knows what happens inside a marriage except the people in it. But others weren't so forgiving. The court of public opinion is harsh, especially when someone once held up as a spiritual leader falls. And through it all, neither Joni nor Doug said much. Joni released a short, carefully worded statement about healing and trusting God's plan. Doug said nothing publicly for weeks. The silence only fueled the speculation. Were they hiding something? Were they protecting each other, or just trying to survive the storm without making it worse? Behind the scenes, sources say Joni was devastated, not just emotionally, but spiritually. She had believed in this marriage. She had put her trust, her heart, and her hope into it. And now she was picking up the pieces again. Privately, those close to her say she was focused on protecting her children and her ministry. She wanted to move forward, but the weight of public expectation made every step feel heavier. The divorce had ripple effects far beyond their own lives. Staff at Daystar felt the tension. Viewers felt betrayed. Friends were forced to pick sides. And every time Joni walked into a meeting or onto a stage, she knew that people weren't just seeing a ministry leader, they were seeing a woman whose personal life had become public property. In the weeks that followed, the headlines began to fade. The internet moved on to new stories. But the damage had been done. Joni's carefully crafted image was cracked, and no matter how well she carried herself in public, the pain behind her eyes told a story words couldn't. Doug retreated from the spotlight, his once busy schedule now filled with silence. Whether he would rebuild his platform remained uncertain. What was clear, though, was that nothing would be the same for either of them. Sometimes the collapse doesn't come with an explosion, sometimes it comes quietly. A missed appearance, a strange silence, a carefully written statement, and before you know it, everything that looked solid starts to fall. For Joni and Doug, the collapse was slow but final. A love story that had once inspired many now stood as a reminder that even the strongest-looking walls can hide cracks too deep to repair. And for those watching, it was a wake-up call that no public image is ever the full story. At first, people thought the storm had passed. The divorce between Joni Lamb and Dougweiss had already shaken the Christian community to its core. Many believed the worst was over, but they were wrong. In the weeks that followed, a new wave of whispers began to rise, rumors of legal trouble, financial issues, and investigations that threatened to drag Doug, and possibly even Joni, into deeper waters. Dougweiss had built his reputation over decades. As a Christian counselor, he had helped countless couples navigate through difficult seasons in their marriages. His books were on shelves in Christian homes. His face had appeared on national broadcasts. He was trusted, respected, until now. After the divorce, Doug became unusually quiet. His social media, once active and filled with inspirational quotes, was suddenly inactive. Public appearances were canceled. Speaking engagements disappeared from his calendar without explanation. That silence didn't go unnoticed. People started asking questions. Why had he vanished so suddenly? Was he just taking time to heal? Or was there something more serious going on? Then came the first report, unconfirmed but persistent. It claimed that Doug was under investigation related to his private counseling practice. Some said there were financial discrepancies. Others hinted at lawsuits filed by former clients. At first, these seemed like just more gossip, but the sources were getting closer to the inner circle. People who had once worked with Doug, people who had sat in meetings with him, people who were suddenly choosing not to stay silent. One former employee spoke anonymously, saying there were things swept under the rug for years and that the divorce had opened the door for truths to finally come out. Another claimed Doug had been reckless with business decisions, possibly violating client trust or mishandling funds. Nothing was official, but the smoke was getting thicker and it was getting harder to believe there was no fire. Joni, meanwhile, was caught in the crossfire. She had just come out of a deeply personal crisis, one that played out in front of millions. Now, with Doug's name tied to possible legal trouble, she had to face another challenge, protecting her ministry, her reputation, and her family. Even if she had no direct involvement in Doug's business dealings, the connection alone was enough to raise eyebrows. People started wondering, did she know? And if she did, when? For Joni, it was a nightmare she never expected. She had stood by Doug in public, talked about their love story, and shared it as a testimony of faith and restoration. And now, with everything falling apart, she felt blindsided. Some sources close to her said she was heartbroken, not just because the marriage ended, but because of what it was built on. Possibly lies, or at the very least, things left unsaid. Inside Daystar, the atmosphere was tense. The network had already been through scandal and leadership transitions. After Marcus Lamb's passing, Joni had worked hard to keep things running, to preserve the mission, the brand, the faith. Now, with Doug's name potentially becoming a liability, damage control began quietly behind the scenes. Publicly, Joni kept calm. She gave no interviews, made no comments about the rumors. Her team put out generic messages about focusing on the future and trusting God's plan. But internally, she was shaken. She had spent years fighting for her family's name. She couldn't afford another scandal. Meanwhile, Doug remained hidden. Friends who tried reaching out got vague responses or no answer at all. Churches that once partnered with him began distancing themselves. Ministries that had supported his work removed old content. His name, once spoken with respect, now came with caution. Some said Doug was preparing for a legal battle. Others believed he was working on a public statement or even a tell-all to defend himself. But nothing came. The longer the silence dragged on, the more people assumed the worst. The public, of course, filled in the blanks. They speculated endlessly. Was there fraud, hidden affairs, counseling ethics violations? Theories exploded across social media, YouTube, and Christian blogs. Some claimed Joni had found out about the legal issues before the divorce and had quietly stepped away to protect Daystar. Others believed she had been betrayed again. Through it all, the one thing that never came was clarity. No formal charges, no official investigations made public, just a growing pile of questions and a silence that screamed louder with each passing day. Joni's supporters remained loyal, defending her character and applauding her strength. They saw her as a victim of bad timing and misplaced trust. But even they had to admit the situation was getting darker. If Doug was guilty of anything, the fallout wouldn't just affect him, it would stain everything connected to him. And Joni, by default, would be forced to carry part of that weight. What comes next? That's the question everyone keeps asking. Will Doug face legal action? Will Joni speak out? Will Daystar address the elephant in the room? Right now, no one knows. What was once a story of love after loss has become a complicated, painful web of broken trust, unanswered questions, and a future that feels more uncertain than ever. And in the midst of it all, two people are left standing. One in silence, the other trying to rebuild. Joni may never get the closure she deserves. Doug may never recover the name he once had. But the truth has a way of rising, even in the slowest, quietest way. Sooner or later, the silence will break. And when it does, the world will finally see the full picture of what really happened behind the scenes.